Over 70,000 years ago, amidst the arid and demanding landscapes of East Africa, a small group of modern humans, perhaps just a few hundred individuals, made a fateful decision. They left behind the land where their ancestors had lived for countless generations and set off on a journey into the unknown. They had no maps, no compass, only the stars above and their ancestral instincts to guide them. They crossed desolate deserts, waded through ancient rivers, and one day their footprints touched the soil on the other side of the Red Sea. That moment marked the beginning of an extraordinary story, the story of tribes who would shape the fate of humanity as we know it. Each step they left behind became the seed of a civilization to come. Yet, ironically, few of them were ever named in the annals of history. Today, we call them the Lost Tribes, those who once walked, lived, and disappeared, but whose legacy lives on in all of us. Modern science may not know the names, customs, or beliefs of these early people, but one truth remains indisputable. They existed, and they are the source of us all. The first and most enduring trace left by humanity in each of us is not language or artifacts, but DNA. Within every living cell of modern humans lies the genetic memory of our most ancient ancestors, a living map of history written in the sequences of our genes. Thanks to the rapid advancement of genetic research, scientists have identified haplogroups, genetic branches that allow them to trace the movements of our ancestors across continents. And every one of those branches leads back to a single origin: East Africa. Somewhere in what is now Ethiopia or Sudan, Homo sapiens first emerged around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. And around 70,000 years ago, one particular lineage of that species made a choice that would alter the course of history forever. They crossed the Bab el-Mandeb Strait when sea levels were still lower than today and entered the Arabian Peninsula. We may never know exactly why they left. Perhaps they sought new food sources. Perhaps climate shifts forced their hand. Or maybe social tension compelled a splinter group to find a new home. Whatever the reason, their decision marked the beginning of a global human odyssey. From the Middle East, their descendants branched out. Some moved north through the Fertile Crescent into Europe, where they would encounter the Neanderthals, another human species already inhabiting the region. Others traveled eastward, passing through Iran and the Indian subcontinent, spreading into Southeast Asia. Some ventured into dense forests, while others braved the oceans and reached Pacific islands and even Australia, where today's Aboriginal people still carry unique genetic fragments found nowhere else. These migrations did not leave behind maps, but they created an invisible atlas, one imprinted in the very structure of our DNA. Each region they reached holds clues, a distinct cultural motif, a stone tool shaped in a particular way, a burial ritual passed down through generations, or simply a gene mutation quietly passed from parent to child over millennia. Not all groups that left Africa left equally visible traces. Many of these early tribes vanished, leaving behind little more than a fragment of bone in a cave, or an unexplained strand of DNA in a modern population. They lived, loved, reproduced, and were eventually extinguished, their stories buried in silence. These were not necessarily small or insignificant groups. Some might have dominated vast territories, thriving for thousands of years, but because they left no grand monuments, written language, or cities, they faded from view. Some researchers refer to them as silent civilizations, cultures that thrived outside of the urban model, leaving behind no structures for archaeologists to discover easily. Yet, even if they were forgotten by name, their presence lives on in us. What we inherit from them is not only our skin tone or physical traits, but a deep-rooted instinct to explore, to move, to seek understanding. It was that same instinct that pushed them to venture away from the familiar. They had no compass, but they followed the stars. They had no maps, but they read the land and the wind. And because of their courage, humanity did not remain confined to one corner of Africa, but spread across the globe. In a profound sense, we modern humans are still continuing that journey. Every time we seek knowledge, cross a new frontier, or ask questions about our past, we're walking the same path those ancient travelers began. They don't need monuments to be remembered. As long as we breathe, their story lives on. Every great migration in history started with a small step just like theirs, taken thousands of years ago toward an uncertain horizon. That was the beginning of our human story, and it is only the first chapter in the grand saga of migration and memory that we are about to uncover together. Long before the invention of sails, before compasses guided explorers, and long before writing preserved memory, early humans had already begun traversing vast bodies of water in ways once thought impossible. They were not merely walkers of land, but, remarkably, the world's first voyagers of the sea. Their journeys, lost in the mists of time, left behind few structures or monuments. And yet, in bones, tools, DNA, and oral traditions, they whispered stories of a remarkable migration that reshaped the map of early humanity, not across deserts or mountains, but along shorelines and across oceans. After stepping out of Africa, a branch of Homo sapiens began traveling eastward, following a coastal path that would eventually become known as the Southern Dispersal Route. These groups hugged the shores of the Arabian Peninsula, moved across southern Iran, and reached the Indian subcontinent, where they found fertile river basins and abundant resources. But their journey did not end there. Within a few thousand years, by roughly 50,000 years, a Gosam had crossed into Southeast Asia and then embarked on one of the boldest feats in human prehistory, the crossing to Australia. Even during the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower and land bridges more common, there remained considerable stretches of open water between Southeast Asia and the Sahul landmass. The gaps between islands, such as the treacherous Timor Strait, could not have been crossed by accident. This implies something profound. Our ancestors may have developed primitive maritime technology and navigational knowledge much earlier than historians once believed. Archaeological evidence supports this theory. On the Australian mainland, stone tools and hearth remains have been dated to around 50,000 years, artifacts unmistakably linked to Homo sapiens. Meanwhile, genetic evidence from Aboriginal Australians reveals an ancient lineage that split from other non-African populations soon after the first out-of-Africa migration. These genetic lineages have remained remarkably distinct, suggesting a long period of isolation from other human populations. In their DNA lies a direct line back to those early explorers, undisturbed by later migrations. Further east, in the lush islands of Melanesia and New Guinea, similar patterns emerge. The people of these regions also carry unique genetic signatures tied to this early wave of migration. In fact, Modern Melanesians possess up to 5% Denisovan DNA, suggesting interbreeding with an archaic human species that lived in the region before Homo sapiens arrived. These ancient crossings, though undocumented in written form, were perhaps remembered in other ways. Some Aboriginal Australian oral traditions speak of ancestral beings who crossed vast waters, shaping the land and its creatures, a mythological account that may encode distant memories of real prehistoric journeys. The same maritime courage can be seen in the survival of isolated labus, such as the Andamanese Islanders or the Eta people of the Philippines. These populations, genetically and culturally distinct, have long been studied for the insight they provide into early human migration. The Andamanese, for instance, represent one of the oldest continuous human populations outside Africa, maintaining languages and customs that may reflect aspects of life tens of thousands of years ago. Their genetic makeup shows a deep divergence from other Asian groups, further supporting the theory of a very early, independent migration path along the coast. It's important to note that much of the physical evidence for these journeys lies underwater today. Sea levels have risen over 100 meters since the last ice age, submerging many of the ancient coastal routes early humans would have used. What might have once been visible trails of movement settlements, tool sites, burial grounds, now rest at the bottom of oceans and seas. This makes it harder for archaeologists to trace these migrations directly. But each new discovery, whether a submerged cave site or a fragment of ancient bone, adds another piece to the puzzle. In Southeast Asia, discoveries in caves such as Naya in Borneo or Liang Bua in Flores have revealed long-term human presence stretching back tens of thousands of years. These findings are often accompanied by traces of fire use, shell middens, and animal remains, painting a picture of adaptable, resourceful coastal dwellers. Although these ancient people may not have left stone monuments, their ingenuity in crossing oceans and thriving in new environments was a monumental achievement in itself. What is most extraordinary is how early humans transformed the sea from a barrier into a bridge. They did not flee from the coastline, but embraced its texploiting tidal rhythms, foraging from reefs, and likely crafting rafts or canoes using materials like bamboo, reeds, or hollowed logs. The ocean, once assumed too vast or dangerous for early humans, became a highway for exploration, discovery, and settlement. These maritime pioneers didn't just move, they reshaped entire ecosystems, introduced fire management techniques, and carried with them the seeds of language, ritual, and memory. In these migrations, we see the early stirrings of what it means to be human, the boldness to seek new horizons, the adaptability to survive in unknown landscapes, and the desire to pass on knowledge even, if not through writing, then through story, image, and custom. The rock art of Northern Australia, for instance, tells complex stories of ancestral beings and landscape formation. Though spiritual in tone, these myths mirror the themes of journey, transformation, and encounter central truths of human migration that remain unchanged across time. And yet, many of the groups involved in this chapter of history have faded from broader global memory. Their names are missing from textbooks, their languages endangered or lost, their lands colonized and reshaped, but their legacy endures. In the structure of our DNA, in the diversity of our cultures, and in the oral histories passed from one generation to the next, they remain. They were not merely survivors or wanderers. They were navigators of the unknown, They crossed waters their descendants would one day fly over, and in doing so, they became the first to realize that the world was not divided but connected. In tracing the movements of these early coastal tribes, we glimpse a world before history a time when human potential was already immense, though its tools were simple. These lost tribes didn't vanish. They live on, not only in bloodlines, but in the very idea of movement itself. Every step we take toward knowledge, every curiosity about the past, is an echo of the same instinct that compelled them to push forward into uncharted waters, toward new life, and the sea, vast and unyielding, welcomed them. As the earliest settlers stepped onto the Australian continent and the southern islands of the Pacific, another branch of modern humans continued migrating northward and northwest, deep into the vast landmass of Eurasia. There, the climate grew harsher, the terrain more formidable, and, most notably, they were not alone. This was a land already inhabited by others. The encounter between Homo sapiens and older human species, such as the Neanderthals and Denisovans, did more than redraw the genetic map of our species. It ushered in an entirely new chapter in evolutionary history, one defined by convergence, blending, and eventual disappearance. At that time, Europe was not an empty frontier. From as far back as 400,000 years ago, Neanderthals had been living across large parts of Europe and Western Asia. They possessed large brains, sturdy bodies adapted to cold climates, and sophisticated tool-making abilities. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest they also practiced burial rituals and may have had some form of spoken language. Around 45,000 years ago, as Homo sapiens entered Europe, the two species coexisted for a time. And then, quite suddenly, in evolutionary terms, Neanderthals disappeared. Not in war or catastrophe, but gradually influencing traits such as immunity, skin tone, hair texture, and other physical characteristics. Their legacy lives on in our blood. Neanderthals were not alone in their quiet merging with Homo sapiens. In Eastern Asia and parts of Siberia, yet another archaic human species, the Denisovans, also interbred with incoming modern humans, known primarily from a single finger bone found in the Denisova cave in Russia. Denisovans have nonetheless left a significant genetic footprint. Populations in Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, and some Southeast Asian indigenous groups carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. These ancient interactions may have given rise to adaptive traits such as the gene variant EPase-1 in Tibetans, which improves oxygen efficiency at high altitudes, an evolutionary gift from a now vanished lineage. What emerges from this is not a linear narrative of human expansion, but a complex web of interactions, detours, and intersections, with unfamiliar landscapes and with challenges that prompted adaptation and integration. Many of the groups that Homo sapiens met along the way vanished without a trace, leaving no stories, no names, and often only faint genetic echoes. Or across the Asian steppes, there may once have been tribes who shared fires, tools, and perhaps language with our ancestors, then faded into extinction, leaving behind nothing but stone tools or a handful of genetic markers. One of the clearest traces of these migrations and collisions lies not just in genes, but in language. Language is a living cultural fossil. It evolves, splits, and merges, but it also preserves deep patterns. Linguists analyzing thousands of existing languages have found strong evidence of ancient language, families that may mirror early migration paths, now spans from India to Western Europe, encompassing tongues as diverse as Hindi, English, Greek, and Persian. This immense linguistic reach is a silent witness to prehistoric migrations across continents, perhaps remnants of older tongues spoken by peoples displaced or absorbed by later waves, while genes and languages help us trace the broad contours of humanity's movement. It is culture that brings these forgotten tribes to life. Culture isn't only found in writing or ruins, it lives in tattoos, pottery designs, house construction, ancestor rituals, lullabies, and seasonal festivals. In the Amazon rainforest, in Tibetan highlands, and in Southeast Asia's forested hills, indigenous communities continue to embody the legacy of those who came before them, unknowingly preserving traditions that stretch back tens of thousands of years. These people may not see themselves as descendants of lost tribes, but their customs, languages, and even gestures carry fragments of human history otherwise lost to time. We will never know the names of every tribe that once walked the earth, those who lived, loved, raised children, and vanished. But they are still here, in the shape of our cheekbones, in the depth of our eyes, in the snippets of DNA we carry without knowing. Perhaps we cannot read their stories in full, but our very existence is evidence of their journey. They do not need statues to be remembered. We are their monuments, living, breathing records of migrations and meetings long past, somewhere between the mingling of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, between a language now extinct and a myth still whispered around a fire. History was born. And that journey, the great human migration, is not finished, continues, carried forward in every question we ask, in every search we make to understand where we came from and who walked before us. At the edge of the great northern forests, in the wide open steppes of Central Asia, and beneath the shadow of snow-covered mountains stretching from the Caucasus to the Himalayas, other migrations quietly unfolded, less well-known, perhaps, but no less profound. These were not sudden waves of conquest, but slow currents of movement, tribes splitting, reforming, adapting to new climates and geographies. Some became herders following wild game. Others turned to river valleys, learning to cultivate and settle. Over time, their identities shifted, languages evolved, and memories faded. Yet deep beneath the surface of today's world, the echoes of those ancient wanderers still linger, encoded in genes, embedded in cultural traces, and etched into the very place names that scatter across Eurasia. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, long after the initial out-of-Africa migrations, small bands of humans who had once lived as hunter-gatherers began transitioning to a new way of life. This shift, known as the Neolithic Revolution, first emerged in the fertile Crescenta swath of land stretching through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. It was here that wheat and barley were first domesticated, where goats and sheep were first tamed. But this wasn't merely an agricultural shift, it was a societal transformation. As people began to settle and grow food, populations expanded, villages became permanent, clans became tribes, and as resources became more centralized, so too did leadership, belief systems, and conflict. Not all groups chose this path. In fact, many continued their nomadic lifestyles, adapting to the changing environments of the post-glacial world. As forests advanced and retreated, as rivers carved new routes through valleys, people followed. One group might have moved seasonally, chasing herds. Another might have settled for decades before moving on. The result was a slow, almost imperceptible push into new territories, north into the steppes, east into the mountains, and west toward the edges of Europe. With each movement, they left fragments behind, a type of arrowhead, a bone needle, a hearth of charred seeds. In some cases, their traces are still visible, today not in museums, but in the cultural DNA of the people who inhabit those lands. Take the Yamnaya, for example. Emerging from the steppes north of the Black Sea around 5,000 years ago, they are believed to have been expert horse riders and herders. Their burial mounds, known as kurgans, dot the landscape of southern Russia and Ukraine. For a long time, they were just another prehistoric culture, but then came the genetic breakthroughs. Studies showed that the Yamnaya carried a particular combination of genetic markers that now appear across large swaths of Europe and South Asia. More than that, they brought with them a language, the Proto-Indo-European tongue, that would eventually splinter into nearly all the major language families of Europe, as well as many in South and Central Asia. The spread of Indo-European languages is perhaps one of the most striking examples of cultural memory embedded in speech. From Ireland to India, people now speak languages that descend from a single ancient root, likely once spoken around communal fires on the Eurasian steppes. This linguistic unity beneath surface diversity hints at one of the most successful, though largely invisible, human expansions in history. But how did such an ancient language spread so widely? It likely wasn't conquest in the traditional sense, but rather a slow and steady process of integration-migration combined with marriage, trade, and shared technologies. Over generations, the newcomers and the indigenous populations began to blend, not just genetically, but culturally. Yet, while the Indo-European legacy is widespread, it is far from the only thread in the human story. Many other groups existed in parallel, and some persisted in isolation. In remote corners of the Caucasus, in mountain valleys of Central Asia, in forests of Eastern Europe, and on islands off the northern coast, people continued to speak languages unrelated to anything else on Earth. Some of these languages survive today as isolates, enigmatic reminders of once diverse linguistic landscapes. Others are only known from inscriptions or fragmentary oral histories. Cultural evidence, too, hints at the diversity of prehistoric migrations. Pottery styles, burial customs, building techniques all differ subtly from region to region. In the Balkans, for instance, the Cucutini Tripelia culture flourished between 5,500 and 2,700 BCE, creating some of the largest known prehistoric settlements with concentric streets and sophisticated ceramics. These people vanished mysteriously, but left behind a visual language in the form of intricate spirals and symbolic motifs. Were they related to Indo-Europeans, or a completely separate lineage of farmers and artisans lost to time? The answer remains elusive, but their artifacts speak across millennia of a culture rich in imagination and order. Meanwhile, in the East, the first signs of migration toward what would become China began to form. The Yellow River Basin would one day host complex civilizations, but long before that, waves of small tribal groups passed through, some settling, some continuing further north or south. The region's Neolithic cultures, such as Yangshao and Longshan, carried different traditions, often marked by distinct pottery styles and burial practices. They, too, were part of the broader human story, moving, adapting, and redefining the land. As these ancient peoples spread and mixed, Some cultural ideas moved faster than the people themselves. One group might adopt a new style of pottery or a method of animal domestication without ever encountering the original inventors. This form of cultural migration, the movement of ideas, not bodies, complicates the task of tracing lost tribes. It is possible for a culture to leave no genetic trace, but still influence the world profoundly through shared knowledge and technology. Across the Eurasian continent, the landscape itself holds the memory of these movements. The rivers once followed by herders now run past modern cities. Ancient trade paths have become highways. Sacred hills have become forgotten ruins. In this layered geography, we can still see the contours of old decisions: where to settle, when to leave, who to merge with, and what to carry forward. Each tribe that moved across the land carried more than just tools. They carried myths, songs, kinship systems, and dreams. Though we can no longer see their faces or hear their voices, we still live among their choices. We repeat their words unknowingly. We walk over their roads. We inherit their strengths and vulnerabilities. And in some quiet way, we still carry the same impulse to move, to adapt, to remember. The great migrations of prehistory were not random. They were purposeful, even if that purpose has been long forgotten. And though the tribes may be lost to time, their stories are not. They live in Usin, our genes, in our languages, in the very shape of our shared humanity. As the earliest tribes crossed seas, traversed forests, and settled into new lands, the world began to witness a deeper transformation, not merely physical migration, but the spread of memory, symbols, and belief. These groups, once isolated by geography, slowly came into contact through primitive trade, intermarriage, or shared rituals practiced in the margins between territories. It was during this time that culture began to take on more than survival. Value it became identity. Languages grew richer. Spiritual symbols emerged. Legends were passed from generation to generation. The so-called lost tribes were not just wanderers, they were the first custodians of the human soul. One of the clearest signs of this emerging consciousness is the repetition of symbolic patterns across vast distances. From cave walls in Spain to river valleys in South Asia, similar motifs appear: spirals, handprints, humanoid forms, stylized animals. What is striking is that many of these symbols emerged in regions separated by thousands of miles and with no evidence of direct contact. Could it be that early humans shared a symbolic language? Or perhaps these signs reflect a common ancestral psychology, a shared way of interpreting the cosmos and their place within it. Beyond visual art, religious rituals and spiritual behavior also began to take shape. Burial customs grew more elaborate. Coming-of-age rites took on formal structures. Communities carved out sacred spaces, often aligned with celestial bodies or seasonal events. The temple site of Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey dating back over 11,000 years, stands as one of the most astonishing examples. Built before agriculture, it challenges conventional ideas that religion followed settlement. Instead, it suggests that spiritual longing may have driven people to gather, cooperate, and form stable societies. If so, the lost tribes of this era were not just seeking new lands, but new meaning, a deeper connection to the invisible forces they sensed in the world. At the same time, early exchange networks began to form. These were not trade routes as we know them today, but webs of shared knowledge and materials: jade beads, obsidian blades, exotic shells, distinct pottery techniques. Across Asia, from the Altai Mountains to the Ganges Plains, archaeologists have uncovered artifacts that originated hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from where they were found. This shows that communication, even without a shared language, was possible. The ancient world was more connected than we once believed. These routes created what might be called heritage corridors, where cultural ideas moved as freely as people. This period also witnessed the first signs of social hierarchy within egalitarian communities. Early human societies had largely been organized around equality, with shared resources and collective decision-making. But as agriculture increased surplus and communities grew, differences began to emerge. Some families controlled more land, more livestock, or more prestige. Burials began to reflect these disparities. Some individuals were interred with fine ornaments, ceremonial tools, or animal sacrifices, while others were laid to rest plainly. These material distinctions point to the rise of leaders, elites, and eventually classes. And with hierarchy came new roles: healers, storytellers, guardians of tradition, each carrying forward pieces of the tribe's collective identity. Memory itself began to change. No longer simply oral stories told around fires. Memory became embedded in objects, carved pendants, ceremonial tools, etched stone tablets. These were the first texts, not read with the eyes, but with the heart and communal understanding. Each object held meaning, rooted in myth and memory, and when a tribe vanished, these were often the only remnants that endured. In this way, a necklace found in a burial mound or a design traced onto pottery becomes a whisper from the past, saying, "We were here, we lived, we remembered." Tragically, many of the communities that played vital roles in these early networks left no direct descendants. Some were gradually assimilated, their identities dissolved into the fabric of emerging civilizations. Others were lost to climate change, epidemic, or natural disaster. Their languages died, their rituals faded. What survives are fragment songs with no known language, dances with forgotten meanings, patterns carved into clay or stone. And yet, these fragments matter. They remind us that history is not only written by victors or preserved by empires. It is also carried by those who vanish, whose legacy survives in the dust. To understand human history is to look not only at the monuments and triumphs, but at the silences, at the unnamed voices that gave rise to the very structures we now take for granted. The lost tribes built no pyramids, wrote no grand texts, and yet they shaped the conditions for both. They were the soft soil in which the seeds of civilization took root. Their disappearance is not only a matter of time, but of perception. We forget them because they did not leave behind buildings of stone. But their true legacy lies in how they lived, how they believed, how they made sense of the world. They taught that stories could be sacred, that symbols could hold power, that the unseen could bind a people, and in doing so, they laid the groundwork for religion, art, and myth. Today, as we dig through ruins and decode ancient genomes, we are not merely uncovering lost data, we are listening. Each shard of pottery, each gene variant, each buried artifact is part of a quiet language, one that connects us not only to known ancestors, but to those who disappeared before the ink of history could capture their names. The lost tribes did not vanish in vain. Their fire still burns, flickering in our rituals, glowing in our questions. alive in our desire to remember. In seeking them, we do not just recover the past, we reclaim a part of ourselves. As human migrations continued to ripple outward across continents, new environments demanded new adaptations. The planet's vast diversity, its deserts, tundras, rainforests, and highlands shaped the body's beliefs and behaviors of the people who settled in them. While earlier movements had spread human genes and ideas broadly. Now, in this next phase, regional identities began to crystallize. Tribes adapted not only to physical conditions, but also to one another. They developed unique languages, tools, mythologies, and social structures, distinct cultural fingerprints, shaped by thousands of years of interaction with their landscapes. And in many cases, these tribes flourished for centuries or even millennia, only to fade, leaving behind questions far more numerous than answers. One of the most haunting examples lies in the Indus Valley. Around 2600 BCE, a civilization emerged there that would rival the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, centered around cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. This culture featured meticulously planned urban grids, sophisticated drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures. Yet their script remains undeciphered. No Rosetta Stone has emerged to unlock their language. Their decline around 1900 BC remains a mystery. Was it climate change, shifting rivers, internal strife? What's most curious is what they didn't leave behind. No temples, no kings, no grand monuments, just silence. Their people may have dispersed, their traditions absorbed by other communities. But the civilization itself advanced, orderly, and enigmatic vanished. It is the silence of the Indus that makes its story so deeply compelling. A whole culture, once thriving, now lives only through its bricks and broken seals. Elsewhere, in the forests of Europe, the people of the linear pottery culture shaped early Neolithic life. They spread across Central and Eastern Europe, leaving behind longhouses, painted ceramics, and the remains of domestic animals. For a time, they represented the height of agrarian society in the region. But like so many others, they, too, faded. They were replaced by newer cultures, sometimes through war, sometimes through absorption. Archaeologists often speak of cultural layers in the soil, one group buried beneath another, their stories compressed by time and erosion. And in some places, entire strata seem to disappear, as though a people once vibrant were simply erased. In the highlands of Anatolia, the Hashans lived before the arrival of the Hittites. Their language was not Indo-European. Their gods were carved in stone, their rituals buried in temples, but they were slowly absorbed, their identity lost as the Hittite Empire rose. Today, few know their name. Fewer still could describe their customs. Yet echoes of them remain in the religious syncretism of their conquerors, in the myths adapted and reworded by scribes in cuneiform script. What survives is not the people, but the resonance of their presence. This story repeated itself across continents. In sub-Saharan Africa, along the Niger River, complex urban societies, like the city of Jeno, rose and flourished as early as 250 BCE, complete with markets, neighborhoods, and metal industries, long before outside contact. These cities challenged assumptions that sub-Saharan Africa was historically rural or tribal in the narrowest sense. Yet, despite their accomplishments, these urban centers faded. Some were abandoned, others transformed. Their architectural remains speak of organized life, but their written records are scarce, their lineages unclear. They are another part of the Great Forgotten. Further east, along the Pacific coast of South America, the Caral Soup civilization in Peru built pyramids as early as 2600 BCE. They engaged in trade, developed agriculture, and arranged public spaces for gatherings and rituals. And yet, like the Indus, they vanished without explanation. They left no written language. Their buildings remain, but their worldview is lost. Even in regions often considered isolated, such as Oceania, lost tribes emerged and disappeared. The Lapita people, ancestors of modern Polynesians, traveled thousands of kilometers across open ocean using only stars, waves, and birds for navigation. Their pottery styles marked their expansion through Melanesia and into the Pacific. But at some point, the Lapita identity dissolved. The culture fragmented into smaller island societies, each developing unique dialects, traditions, and mythologies. The unifying thread of the Lapita vanished into diversity. In many cases, the disappearance of these tribes was not due to catastrophe, but change. Migrations continued, new technologies emerged, trade routes shifted, languages evolved, myths were reinterpreted. A tribe might live on under a new name, in a new form, speaking a new tongue, carrying the seed of its origin without knowing it. Others were not so fortunate. Disease, invasion, natural disaster, or slow economic collapse erased them. And with their passing went songs, rituals, ecological knowledge, worldviews never recorded. What makes these lost tribes so significant is not only what they left behind, but what they carried for humanity as a whole. Each group was a living experiment in human possibility. Different solutions to survival, different conceptions of the sacred, different models of how to live together. Their diversity was our strength. Every one of them added to the genetic, cultural, and philosophical richness of our species. Their loss is not merely academic, it is a narrowing of the range of what it means to be human. Yet, even now, long after they've vanished, these people still shape us. Genetic traces link us to their bodies. Place names echo their tongues. Agricultural techniques descend from their trial and error. Even stories that feel timeless, the flood myth, the trickster figure, the cosmic egg-may, have roots in their oral traditions. Their presence is ghost-like, woven into the structure of our daily lives. We forget them not because they were unimportant, but because they succeeded in blending so completely into what came after. In some sense, every culture we know today is built atop layers of others long forgotten. The roads we travel were once game trails. The cities we live in may sit on ancient settlements. Our very gestures and idioms could be inherited from tribes whose names we'll never know. When we look at history this way, not as a ladder, but as a web, we begin to appreciate how much we owe to the unnamed, the undocumented, the unseen. And so we honor the lost, not with silence, but with curiosity, with the effort to uncover, to remember, to piece together stories from bones and fire pits, from broken pottery and sacred hills. They may not have written books, but their lives were epics in themselves, chapters in the long and unfolding saga of what it means to be human. From the wild frontiers of prehistory to the centers of later civilizations, the journey of humanity has always been one of movementa, continuous flow of bodies, memory, and legacy. While the previous parts traced the footsteps of lost tribes through archaeological remains, genetics, language, and myth, this final part invites us to pause, look ahead, and ask, What do we carry from them in our lives today? Are we their descendants in spirit as much as in blood? And perhaps more importantly, are we continuing their legacy or quietly letting it fade? In the modern world, most of us live in cities, immersed in technology, and often unaware of our ancestral links. Yet, if we look closely, the presence of lost tribes still surrounds us in subtle, almost invisible ways. A textile pattern on a scarf, a folk dance at a village festival, the name of a river, a traditional remedy whispered from grandmother to granddaughter. All of these may be fragments of distant memories, remnants of a people who no longer appear on maps but live on in our culture. Today's geneticists can trace a person's ancestry tens of thousands of years into the past, mapping their lineage across continents, across generations. A person in modern Europe might carry the DNA of Neanderthals. Someone in Southeast Asia may bear traces of Denisovan genes. A person of Native American heritage could carry markers from ancient Siberian tribes. Our bodies are living maps, each cell carrying echoes of encounters, intermingling, and migrations long gone. Language, too, bears the ghosts of vanished peoples. Even though many ancient tongues have been lost, their structures, rhythms, and words linger in modern speech. Some words exist across unrelated languages without clear origin, drifting through cultures like fossilized sounds. They may be the final whispers of tribes whose entire heritage now lives on in a single, untranslatable word. Even in pop culture films, novels, games, music, we repeatedly return to archetypes born from our tribal past: the wanderer, the outcast, the memory keeper, the firebringer, the storyteller. These are not accidental motifs. They are modern avatars of ancient roles carried forward through millennia. In today's tribes, musical collectives, online communities, fan cultures, activist circles, we still witness the human urge to form bonds, pass down shared stories, and protect something sacred. The tribal impulse has never disappeared. It has only transformed. Meanwhile, all around the globe, indigenous communities are fighting to preserve their languages, customs, and land in the face of globalization. Every year, dozens of languages fall silent. With the passing of a tribe's last elder, an entire worldview often vanishes. The lost tribes are not just figures of the distant past, they are vanishing right now, sometimes beside us, sometimes in silence, sometimes ignored. Yet there is hope. Across continents, young people in indigenous communities are relearning their ancestral languages. Researchers are recording oral histories, preserving songs, mapping sacred sites. Technology, once feared as a force of erasures, now becoming a tool for preservation. Digital archives, language apps, virtual reconstructions, all are helping ensure that the voices of these cultures endure. The story of the lost tribes is no longer just one of disappearance, is also a story of resilience and even revival. Most importantly, this story includes us. We are not just observers, we are continuations. The questions once asked around fire circles are now asked in classrooms, in laboratories, in online forums. The spirit of those who migrated, who remembered, who marked stone with meaning lives on in our search for understanding, identity, and connection. Each time we walk, whether to learn, to explore, or simply to find our place in the world, we are retracing steps first taken tens of thousands of years ago. We are the children of those who crossed forests, oceans, deserts, who built homes, shaped languages, and faded into myth. Yet because of them, we exist. Because of them, we think, imagine, and ask questions. So when we remember the lost tribes, we're not just honoring the past. We're re-looking into a mirror across time, recognizing that the anonymous voices behind our earliest stories are part of what makes us human. No journey ends as long as someone keeps telling it, and as long as someone somewhere asks, who were they? How did they live? Those tribes will never truly be lost. Thank you for joining this journey through the footsteps of the lost. Tribes, those unnamed souls who laid the foundations for who we are today. They may not have left behind their names, but in every step, every story, and every trace, they shaped the human world we now inherit. If this journey moved you, sparked your curiosity, or simply made you see the past in a new light, feel free to follow 4 more stories like this. Sometimes, the path to understanding ourselves begins with remembering those the world forgot.